When I was in kindergarten, we had a class puppet. Class puppets are much safer than class pets, you see. There's no chance of it escaping, and there's no way to accidentally kill a class puppet. Although I suppose you could lose or damage it, but either way, that's far less emotionally scarring than the alternative. Ours was a dragon, one with two of those marionette-style handles that controlled its legs and its head. And I can still remember how excited I was when I got chosen to take it home on a Friday, because that meant that I would have it for the entire weekend. I took pictures of it doing different things. I kept it away from our dogs, and I generally cared for it, because for the whole weekend, in the midst of all of my excitement and joy, one thing stuck out in my head. The puppet didn't belong to me. It wasn't mine. It belonged to the class. I had simply been entrusted with it for the weekend, but I mustn't confuse that with ownership. On Monday, I would still have to bring the puppet back and hand it off to the next person in the same condition that I had received it. This was a mindset that was not shared by the characters in our gospel reading for today. As I announced at the beginning of worship, today is the first of two stewardship-focused Sundays. And while this story might not be what immediately comes to mind when you think of a stewardship story, it's no parable of the talents or the widow's mite, it's still pretty solid. I mean, it certainly explains why we don't do a door-to-door campaign, if that's the kind of response we can expect. No wonder some people have averse feelings regarding this conversation. I do thank you for not responding to me in the same way that the tenants responded, although I am separated through a computer screen, thankfully. Or at least the clubs and the rocks are hidden at the moment. So the story for today follows the one that we heard last week. As Pastor Laura said, this exchange that Jesus is having in the temple with the disciples and the chief priests, the Pharisees, the elders of the faith. This exchange happens after his triumphant entry into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. It comes after Jesus' righteous, anger-fueled temple tantrum, a term that has always made me laugh, but don't let the humor fool you, because it was a bold and prophetic act of restorative justice, a reclaiming of that which was meant to be holy and pure that had been corrupted by the forces of human greed. And now Jesus stands in conversation with them, addressing their questions regarding his authority to preach, teach, and heal. Jesus makes his argument by telling three different parables. The one about the two sons that we heard last week, today's story, which is really more of an allegory, and one more that we will hear next week. During the past few months, we've heard a number of Jesus' parables, his repeated attempts to explain what the kingdom of heaven is like. And in almost all of them, we have seen that he has a great talent for providing all of the pieces, but letting others arrive at the conclusion. He leads you right up to the door, but you got to be the one to walk through it. For all the teachers out there, I'm sure that you have experienced how people tend to remember answers that they figured out for themselves better than answers that were simply handed to them. So let's dig in. There's a landowner who, much like God in the first reading from Isaiah, plants a vineyard, puts a nice little fence around it, digs out a wine press, builds a watchtower, and leases it to some tenants before leaving to go to a foreign land. When harvest time rolls around, he sends servants to collect what is owed to him, his portion of the harvest, which was a common arrangement in that day. But the tenants, they don't want to give up any portion of what they had worked for, so they beat one, they kill another, and they stone the third. In response to this, the landowner sends more servants who meet similar fates until finally he sends his son. Surely they will honor his son. But the tenants, they see it as an opportunity to steal the son's inheritance, so they seize him, throw him out of the vineyard, and kill him. We're going to stop there for a moment because there's a lot going on in this story. For those of us sitting here or at home today who have the benefit of knowing what happens in the next few chapters, it's all too obvious what this story is really about. But for the folks in the story, it's slightly less clear. Despite Jesus' multiple attempts to warn them about the fate that he will ultimately suffer, about how he will be crucified and put to death as a criminal, as an enemy of the state. Despite his warnings, the disciples have refused or simply been unable to hear him. But that being said, the general message of the parable would still have been very obvious. Now, as always with parables, there are multiple ways to interpret the story, but for the purposes of this story, though, the obvious meanings are, well, they're obvious for a reason. The landowner is meant to be God, hence the parallel with the reading from Isaiah. We are the tenants, and the servants that the landowner sends are the different prophets, the different prophetic voices that God has sent over the centuries. And then, of course, the Son is Jesus, which just leaves us with trying to figure out what the vineyard represents. Some might claim that the vineyard represents the financial blessings that God has laid in our lives, and that the portion that the landowner is seeking would be the biblical tithe. And while God would love for you to tithe, as would the church, that's a pretty narrow way of understanding and interpreting this story. It's a pretty narrow way of understanding stewardship as a whole. Too many churches make it only about money. Thankfully, that is not the case here at Bethlehem. Through the diligent and tireless work of people like Dick Dubois and phrases like "thank you for your stewardship," we've begun to restore the original and true meaning of the term. Stewardship is far more than the church's annual fundraising drive, and it shouldn't be framed as being about what you owe to God or to the church. Stewardship really is about how we manage and what we do with the blessings, all of the blessings that God has laid in our lives. The vineyard in this parable represents all of creation. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And then God created the oceans and the lands, the mountains and the valleys, the green grasses of the plains and the mighty sequoias, birch and oak of the forests. God created all of the creeping things that creep on the land, the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. And finally, God created humankind in God's own image and granted us dominion over all of creation. But that word dominion has been the source of so much suffering and destruction in the world. Because although some would claim it as a marching order to subdue and conquer the vast wildernesses of this world, as a free pass to do whatever we want with the bountiful blessings of God's creation, really it was a mandate to care for and protect what God had made, what God had blessed, what God had looked upon as good and very good. The vineyard represents God's blessings, God's creation, everything that has been laid in this world. And God's blessings take on so many different and varied forms. We've all been blessed with different abilities, different passions, different skills, different resources, different ways of viewing the world, different ways of interacting and communicating with one another, different ways of contributing to the rich tapestry that is the people of God, different ways of sustaining and tending to the work of the vineyard. So what then are we to make of the somewhat confusing actions of the landowner? I mean, after what happened to the first messengers, he would have been well within his rights to simply contact the authorities and have the tenants unceremoniously chucked out of the vineyard, or even worse. But for some reason, he doesn't do that. Instead, he sends more messengers, more servants, in the hopes that the tenants will change their minds and agree to the original terms of their arrangement. And when the same thing happens, he chooses then to send his son, of all people. He sends his son thinking, surely they will honor his command. Surely they will recognize his position. But I think he probably knew deep down what would really happen. The landowner did not want to be punitive or harsh with the tenants despite their actions. What he wanted was a restoration of right relationship with them. Say that 5 times fast. But it's the same with God. Notice also in the story what happens when Jesus asks those who are listening what the owner of the vineyard should do when he returns. They say he will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time. Jesus isn't the one who says that. Actually, that sounds like something we would say. That's how we would respond to this story. We who believe that the punishment should match the crime. We who are so eager to offer sentences of condemnation and guilty verdicts, especially when they apply to other people. We who have been unswayed by parable after parable, trying to show us that this is not God's way. We do not have a God who deals with us as we deserve, who returns like for like, tit for tat, a God who is punitive and harsh. We have a God who chases after us again and again and again. A God who desperately wants to be in relationship with us, who wants us to live into the vision that God has for us. So much so that God would send prophetic voices, one after another, calling us to turn from the selfish use of God's blessings, to turn from the destruction of all that we were meant to be caretakers of, to repent and turn backwards towards the source of all that we have in this life. God so wanted to repair a broken relationship with humanity that Jesus, God's only Son, was sent into this world not to condemn it, but so that we might be saved through him. Because the ultimate goal is not to kick us out of the vineyard for doing such a lousy job. It is to transform us into those responsible tenants. It is to encourage us to bear good fruit, to bear the fruits of the Spirit. That's what stewardship is about. It's about asking ourselves the question, how am I utilizing the blessings and resources that God has laid in my life? Am I using them in order to hoard the fruits of the harvest? Or am I using them to help me produce the fruits of the kingdom, which Paul tells us are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? The world around us is in great need of these kind of fruits right now. Anger, bitterness, division, hopelessness, these seem to be the seeds that are being sown in the world these days. And the fruits of those seeds will not nourish. They will not sustain and enliven. They will not build up this world. We have been given this beautiful vineyard to maintain and care for. We have been given blessings that we are called to be stewards and caretakers of, never forgetting the one from whom they came. And when we stray from that calling, when we claim credit for what is not ours to claim credit for, we have a God who reaches out, who calls out, who seeks to renew a relationship with us again and again and again. What kind of tenant will you be? How will you tend God's vineyard? And what will become of the fruits of your labor? Amen.